Thank you very much, Iskandar, and good morning and welcome to everybody attending the conference this morning. I can please invite our esteemed panelists, Professor Razeen and Datin Ami, to switch on their videos, and we'll begin this very interesting panel discussion. So I think I don't want to say too much by way of introduction. I think everybody recognizes that 2020 was an extremely challenging year for the economy, not just in Malaysia, of course, but around the world. And I think going into 2021, we're all hopeful that 2021 will be a year of recovery and reset and even building back better if we can. But I think, as Trisha mentioned, unfortunately, coming into 2021, we're still very much living with the day-to-day reality of the pandemic. So what is the outlook for that recovery? And what will be the long-term impacts of the pandemic? I think 2020 was also notable in other areas. Of course, we saw a change in the leadership of the United States. And what does this mean in terms of impact for the global economy? Here in Malaysia, I think another very important trend that was accelerated by the pandemic is the focus for ESG within business and finance. And that's something I think that will have been accelerated by the pandemic and will continue to be a major determining factor in the business environment moving forward. So I'm really excited, excuse me. So I'm really excited this morning to hear from both of our highly distinguished panelists who will be able to speak both on the global economy and then also on the business context in Malaysia. First, we have Professor Razeen Sali, a visiting professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore, who previously taught at the London School of Economics. He was chairman of the Institute of Policy Studies, the main economic policy think tank in Sri Lanka, and senior advisor to the Minister of Finance. He has been director of the European Centre for International Political Economy, global economy think tank in Brussels, and has held visiting research and teaching positions in the USA, France, Australia, and Hong Kong. He was also chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Competitiveness. Professor Razeen will be talking to us this morning about the state of the global economy heading into 2021 and what we can expect from the significant trends and impacts of the last year. Then I'm very pleased to introduce Datin Ami Moris, Chief Executive of Maybank Kim Eng Group, the investment banking arm of Maybank Group. Datin Ami is responsible for the investment banking and investment management business across MKE's 10-country regional platform. She is an advocate of sustainability first practices, and her mission at MKE is to humanize financial services by helping clients build more profitable and sustainable businesses that help deliver a more equitable and inclusive ASEAN. Amy is most proud of the bank's transformation into one of ASEAN's leading homegrown investment banks and its contribution towards accelerating ASEAN's progress as a globally respected and competitive region. And Amy will be speaking to us about the trends in ESG in the business environment and financial sector, and the particular focus on the key issues to watch for in Malaysia. So the way we're going to proceed is I will invite both of our esteemed panelists to give their opening presentations, setting out the issues for the global economy and for Malaysia. And I'll invite any members of the audience, please, to share your Q&A in the Q&A box, and then we will proceed to a question and answer session. I have many of my own questions too for our two speakers, but I'll try and cover any and all questions from the audience too. We're due to finish by 12, so please do share as many questions as you can, and I'll try to cover as many as possible in the time. Okay, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to invite Professor Razeen, please, to share with us your presentation. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Laurence. Good morning to you, to Trisha, the team, to Datin Ami, and everybody who has joined us. It's a pleasure to be with you. Not in my case, not directly in KL this time, but virtually from Singapore. Let me share my slides. If you'll give me just a moment. There we are. Okay. I'll concentrate on the global economic outlook. So I'll start with the response to the COVID crisis that we've seen around the world and how that's brought us to the present state of play. And then look at prospects in the short term while the vaccine rollout is going on around the world, and then beyond that into the medium term. Then I'll talk a little bit about the international trade outlook and the future of global value chains, which is the area I focus on more specifically for research and teaching. Time allowing, I'll say a little bit about the global energy outlook and for the environment, and wind up with some brief observations on the outlook for the region, that is to say for Southeast Asia. So I'll begin with the COVID crisis and the global economic outlook. What we've seen in the past year, and it's almost exactly a year now since the crisis broke, is the worst slump since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And as I say in this first bullet point, synchronized around the world. The big difference between the crisis that we're in at the moment and the crisis that we experienced just over a decade ago, the global financial crisis that is that whereas that time it was very much a crisis of the West, while China, India, and some other emerging markets continued to power ahead. This time, the crisis, the contraction, the slump is synchronized around the world. Let me unpack that a little bit. This is a chart from the recent IMF World Economic Outlook update, which came out only last week. And what it shows is actually quite a bit of differentiation and divergence. So if you look at the red line, the uninterrupted line, you'll see that after a rather brief contraction, but steep, China rebounded quite rapidly and is growing quite healthily at the beginning of this year. But if we look at the yellow and the blue lines, we see both advanced economies and developing countries other than China having a more prolonged and steeper contraction, as well as a slower and lesser recovery than China. If we go to the projections the IMF makes for countries and regions around the world, let me run through this fairly quickly. If we look at the 2020 estimate for growth, or the lack of it, we see that world output contracted by 3.5% last year, which is the worst performance for the globe since the Second World War, at least. The projection is that there'll be a fairly healthy rebound of about 5.5% this year. That's an upward estimate or correction by the IMF, given that the vaccines have arrived earlier than planned. The rollout is happening fast in some countries, notably the UK and the United States among the big countries. And we see even more stimulus programs led by the US and Japan. If we look at advanced economies, they contracted by about 5% last year. The projection is for them to grow by about 4 to 4.5% this year. And if we break that down, we see that the best performers are actually the United States and Japan. So a somewhat lower contraction than the average and a projected faster rebound than the average. The Eurozone countries, particularly in the south, France, Italy, Spain, and the United Kingdom have had the steepest contraction, the order of about 10%. And they are projected not to actually recover output back to 2019 levels until 2022. If we now look at emerging markets and developing economies, a 2.5% contraction last year overall, and a pretty healthy 6% plus rebound projected for this year. Emerging and developing Asia doing best of all. Contraction last year for the first time since 1968, I think it was, but projected rebound of 8% or more this year, led by China. So as I said before, a smaller contraction from China last year because it came out of the COVID crisis lockdown earlier than others, projected to grow by about 8% plus this year. India has done very badly during this crisis year, projected to contract by about 8%, but projected to have a very healthy rebound this year. And the early signs this year point in that direction. With ASEAN, we see a lower than average contraction, certainly compared with India, with other parts of South Asia, of the order of about 4%, and then growing back to its pre-crisis trend of about 5% this year. That's the projection. We see Latin America doing probably worst of all developing country regions, a 7.5% contraction last year, compounded by the steep fall of commodity prices. So we see that reflected in the big economies like Brazil and Mexico. Pretty bad contraction in the Middle East and Central Asia, commodity rich, oil and gas dependent, of course. If we look further down, I'll go on to the next slide. You look at the trade numbers, which I'm going to come back to a little bit later. World trade contracted by about 10% last year, projected to grow by about 8% this year, so not quite recovering to 2019 levels. Look further down at commodity prices. The oil price declined by about a third last year and is projected to rebound by about a fifth this year. Of course, important for oil producers and exporters, including Malaysia. So I'll leave those big numbers there. Just one more chart here. This gives you an idea of the differences in terms of lost output, led by emerging Asia, ex-China, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East. But with China and the United States actually doing best of all in terms of the contraction of output compared with 2019 levels. That, I hope, gives you a summary idea of the very big picture. Let me make further, I think, very important points about that big picture. The second point I want to make is about deglobalization. In other words, the shrinkage of globalized output, globalization channels in the wake of the COVID crisis. Global trade down by about 10%, foreign direct investment down by up to 30%, remittances down by somewhere between 10 and 20%, and of course, an almost total collapse in global travel and tourism. And we're going to take quite some time to work through the after effects of that. My third point is that this crisis so far, and this is very much a pointer to the future, has been very unequal in its effects within and between countries. So if we look at its effects within countries, across rich, poor, and middle-income countries, we see that it's hit hardest of all the poor, the less skilled, the less educated, the less qualified, women, younger people, and hardest hit of all have probably been the urban poor. It's estimated that about 100 million people have fallen back into absolute poverty as a result of this crisis. And then differences between countries. Generally speaking, developed countries have coped best because they have the best public health care systems. They can afford the vaccines. They're rolling them out faster. And of course, they've been able to afford much bigger stimulus programs. I'll come back to that in a moment. developing countries have been hit harder and the poorest countries hardest of all. We've already seen some sovereign debt defaults for poor countries in severe debt distress, particularly with payments to foreign capital markets. More sovereign debt defaults are probably in the pipeline. The recovery so far from the initial first wave and first set of lockdowns has been slow and extended. So the predictions that there would be a fast rebound in the second half of last year did not materialize. The recovery continues to be pretty slow even now in many countries. So that leaves the question, what prospects are there for a rebound in 2021 and then also more medium term next year and beyond? Let me address that question by saying that I think just as we've seen quite a bit of economic divergence, as I showed you with those charts, in terms of the crisis, we're going to see perhaps even more economic divergence with the rebound from the crisis in the short term while the vaccines are being rolled out and indeed beyond. And I think this economic divergence plays out at three levels. Firstly, within countries. That refers to the differences, the inequalities I mentioned earlier. Secondly, between developed and developed countries. Developed countries standing a better chance, particularly with faster vaccine rollouts and being able to afford much more significant fiscal and monetary stimulus programs to keep economies, indeed people, afloat. And then finally, within the developing world, we're seeing increasing differences. At the moment, it's very much China setting the pace in terms of recovery, while others lag behind. And it's, I suppose, a combination of the poorest countries, those who are in the very low income bracket, those who are very dependent on tourism, those who are very dependent on oil and other commodities for revenue and export and foreign exchange. Those are the countries that will be hit hardest into the medium term. Let me now move on to say something about policy responses to the COVID crisis. We've seen a massive policy response around the world, and particularly in the advanced economies, the OECD economies, mainly in the West, but also including Japan and indeed the richer part of Asia, countries like South Korea, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. So what we've seen is something like in the order of $30 trillion plus of stimulus programs in these countries. It's an unprecedented stimulus led by central banks, printing money and financing government debt as well as corporate debt even more than they did before. In other words, quantitative easing. And we've also seen very big, unprecedented by post-war standards, very big stimulus programs of the order of 10 to 15% of GDP in the OECD economies. If and when President Biden's program does go through, that'll take the US stimulus package to well over 20%, 20-25% of GDP in the United States. And that's certainly cushioned the contraction in output, the loss of income, and the loss of business for producers in the past year. We've seen a commensurate increase in public debt, huge. Debt in the developed countries, public debt is projected to go to about 140%. That's about a 20% increase in the space of a year, from about 60 to 80% outside the West, another 20% increase, which does raise big questions. It raises big questions about the sustainability of these massive and increased levels of debt. though in an environment of very low interest rates, but it's a big question mark as to how long these very depressed near zero interest rates will continue. We see a very different picture in developing countries. Most of them can't afford Western style stimulus programs. They are, an increasing number are in bigger debt distress. Many need restructuring with the help of the IMF and the World Bank. What's been offered so far has been very modest. We'll see if global cooperation will ramp that up in the short to medium term. I think of my own country, Sri Lanka, which went into this crisis with chronically bad public finances and with an increasing amount of debt owed to international capital markets. Sri Lanka is one of those countries that risk a default given the exacerbation of its situation during the course of this crisis. Final point here, with the exception of the European Union, the member states agreed a 750 billion euro essentially fiscal transfer package from the north to the south and the east in mid-year last year. With the exception of the EU, what we've seen in response to this COVID crisis is not global cooperation or international policy coordination, quite the opposite. Rather, we've seen diverse and often conflicting national responses, a kind of national unilateralism, as it were. One big question is whether the new Biden administration will change that game by encouraging and leading more multilateral responses. I suspect not as much as many people expect, but I'll come back to that perhaps later, and that's something we can certainly pick up on in discussion. This is a chart which shows that it's not only traditional Western countries that have had very big stimulus packages. I mean, just look at these charts here. This chart here, we see the fiscal stimulus in Singapore is of the order of about 20% of GDP. It's huge, and that's certainly cushioned the fall here. Singapore, of course, can afford it, and it's not a debt issue for Singapore because Singapore has huge surpluses. So it's perhaps the country best positioned in the world to recover without actually thinking of ways to sustain its greater debt. So we're not going to see big tax rises, for example, or even greater inflationary pressures in order to grow out of debt in Singapore, as we will see in many other countries. A very big stimulus in Korea, even in Malaysia, upper middle income, above 15%, less so in other countries as we go down the list. Okay. Before I talk a little bit about the trade and energy outlooks, let me make some key points. As I say here, 3 shifts shaping the post-vaccine future. So I'm peering here from the short term, beyond the horizon, or to the end of the horizon, to the medium term, as it were. Meaning around the time when vaccines will have been rolled out around the world. And I think the main point I want to make here is that the big trends that we're seeing in the wake of this crisis are not really new. They existed at least since the global financial crisis. What this crisis has done is really to deepen and accelerate those trends. I think that's the main point I want to make. And there are 3 main trends that were evident before this COVID crisis that I think have been accelerated by it and will continue well into the medium term. The first is a pendular shift from the market to the state. Much more government intervention, more restricted markets, both domestically, regionally, and globally. We've seen that during the crisis, and we're likely to see its repercussions, its ramifications well into the medium term. The second is less global cooperation and more national unilateralism. sometimes quite destructive. We see that on the trade front, for example. I expect to see more of that in the medium term. The third big shift, I think, is to more unstable and contested geopolitics, revolving around the US-China conflict, which of course emerged and widened before the COVID crisis, but has been exacerbated by it. Now, if you take those three trends and put them together, and I think they are structural, not cyclical, they will last into the medium, perhaps longer term. It points to the old liberal era being replaced by a new mercantilist one. In other words, one where there's much more government intervention around the world in both domestic and global markets. We've seen previous eras of mercantilism that have been more malign than benign. In other words, more destructive within and between societies, both economically and politically. So I think a big question mark is whether this new mercantilist era will be more malign than benign, or will there be ways of tempering it, of making it less harmful, less destructive than, say, what we saw between the two world wars or in the 16th to the 18th centuries. I'll now come to the international trade outlook and the future of global value chains. As I mentioned early on in my presentation, we've seen a big deglobalization in the wake of this COVID crisis, with trade contracting by about 10%, foreign direct investment even more so. There are two key differences between this deglobalization and the smaller one we saw in the global financial crisis. The first is that this one is synchronized around the world. It's not a case, as was the case last time, of China, India, and others growing while the West contracted. Here we see trade contractions around the world. Secondly, in the last crisis, it was manufacturing trade that was hit hardest, while services, commercial services, with the exception of financial services, were much more resilient and grew more strongly, particularly travel and tourism. This time it's the other way around. We actually see manufacturing trade doing not too badly, especially with producing lots of products for sale with or e-commerce and online commerce, of course, starting with consumer electronics. The sectors of trade that have been hit hardest have actually been in services, and notably travel and tourism, which have collapsed. So we see services doing much worse. We'll see what the rebound will be like in services. Final point here is that even though protectionism was actually increasing before the COVID crisis, particularly revolving around the US-China trade war, we've seen signs of a protectionist upsurge during the crisis. It started with medical supplies, particularly personal protective equipment, and now we see it quite strongly with, if you like, vaccine nationalism. Very little coordinated global response. For example, a very modest start to the World Health Organization's COVAX scheme that has a lot to do with the lack of US leadership under the Trump administration, with countries around the world scrambling to procure their own supplies. Of course, it's developed countries that have the head start here, with most countries around the world and the bulk of the world's population left behind, as it were. And we see most recently in the last few days, the European Union, for example, applying new export restrictions on vaccines in order to defend, to procure its own supplies. So this is a zero-sum situation at the moment. Let's see if it changes. Yes, so this gives you a sense of the chart. Actually, the contraction in international trade is at the most optimistic end of the spectrum in terms of scenarios that were painted 9 months or so ago. That contraction of about 10%, it could have been much, much worse. The medium-term trade outlook. I'll just point out what I think are the really big trends, again, I'm looking into the medium term here. I think we're in the early stages of what will be a significantly more protectionist world trade order into the medium term. One reason for that is that the kind of crisis interventions that we've seen around the world, particularly in terms of subsidies, which have been often quite arbitrary and selective, and a big increase in industrial policy around the world, that will spill over into trade protectionism. Already doing so, we'll see more of that. Many of these measures are going to be very difficult to reverse. So that will have a medium-term spillover into international trade, starting with subsidies. Secondly, I mentioned this point before, pressure towards more national unilateralism at the expense of regional and global cooperation. So it's going to be very difficult to really revive mechanisms, organizations like the WTO, APEC, ASEAN regionally, to restore them to the kind of health that they had in the heyday of globalization before the global financial crisis. Third point, the reorientation of global value chains. The trend until the global financial crisis was for multinationals to lengthen or extend their value chains into developing countries, notably in East Asia, to serve global markets. That was changing even before the COVID crisis, notably accelerated by the US-China trade war and increasing labor costs in coastal China. We're seeing an acceleration of that now. And just to give you a flavor of that, this is from a recent McKinsey Global Institute report. It's highly differentiated. If we look at some sectors, like these global innovation sectors, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, aerospace, automotive, transport equipment, the consumer electronics cluster, semiconductors, because of what's happening in China and the US-China conflict spilling into what's called techno-nationalism, we're seeing companies having to relocate production and essentially split or bifurcate their supply chains, one for China and one for the Western other parts of the world. So that's leading to quite significant production relocation. It has big implications for Southeast Asia. I'll come back to that right at the end. If we look at other sectors, labor-intensive sectors like furniture, textiles, and apparel, actually there was an accelerated shift out of China because of labor cost increases to countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh before the crisis. That continues. If we look at regional processing and resource-intensive industries that were more regionally concentrated, that remains the case. Not much change there. So it's very differentiated in global supply chains. I mentioned this point before, a more fractured, conflictual geopolitical environment revolving around the US-China conflict. That's certainly going to affect trade much more. And the final point I want to make here is that I think what we're seeing emerging, and the crisis reinforces this emergence, is, as I say here, an intensified competition of rival rule systems for international trade, centered on regulatory models developed in the hubs of the United States, the EU, and China. So for a country like Malaysia, Singapore as well, highly trade dependent, it's going to become much more challenging to actually deal with these three different rule systems on things like digital trade, data privacy, cybersecurity, and indeed other things. So all of these are, I think, features of this emerging mercantilist international trade order. Very quickly, the outlook for the for energy and the environment. And I really mentioned this because of Malaysia's dependence on oil and gas. The impact of the COVID crisis, we've seen the biggest contraction in energy demand in 70 years. That's the relevant chart. If we break that down, we see a particularly big contraction of demand in coal and oil, and then to a lesser extent natural gas. But we actually see an increase in demand for renewables in the context of a total contraction in energy demand. So what that points to is actually an accelerated transition away from fossil fuels to renewables. And last year we saw the biggest recorded contraction in CO2 emissions since records began. Now, obviously, we're going to see a rebound in CO2 emissions and in energy demand this year. The question is by how much? And I think the even bigger question is, or concerns, the energy transition. So this is also a medium-term point, not just a short-term cyclical point. We're seeing three big shifts, all accelerated by the COVID crisis. Fossil fuels are in abundant supply at the moment. That will remain the case given that they're produced in an increasing number of countries and regions around the world, and in an atmosphere of prices that will probably remain depressed into the medium term. So it's a buyer's market. While at the same time, renewables are growing faster, albeit from a fairly low base. And that'll be accelerated by even more measures with more financial power in the name of tackling climate change, led by the United States, Japan, and the European Union. And we see an increasing electrification around the world, relying more than before on renewable energy and perhaps less on coal. So that, very finally, let me make some brief observations on the regional economic outlook for Southeast Asia, that is. I won't go into detail here. We can certainly explore these points in discussion. I think the main point I want to make, very much fitting with my broader theme, is differences and divergence in COVID response, which also point to differences and divergence in economic policy and performance in the region in the future. So it's Singapore, with the exception of the migrant worker issue in the early phase of the crisis and the lockdown. Singapore and Vietnam have clearly done best in terms of handling the COVID crisis, both in terms of public health and economic policy. The two are very much related. Malaysia and Thailand handled the first installment of the crisis well, but then worse with the second waves and beyond. And we see really poor responses in Indonesia and the Philippines, and perhaps predictably so in the poorest ASEAN countries. So all of that, I think, is testament to big differences in governance and state capacity on both public policy, on both public health and economic policy across ASEAN. If we look for positive features for Southeast Asia rebounding from the COVID crisis, the growth outlook on the average is pretty good. Just as the growth record was pretty good from the Asian crisis in the late 90s until the COVID crisis, average growth rates across the region of about 5%. I think the prognosis is for the region to recover that 5% benchmark. FDI coming to Southeast Asia is now even higher than it is going to China. It has higher returns of investment. That's promising. And some ASEAN countries actually stand to gain from the reorientation of global value chains or production relocation that I mentioned earlier. So Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam should be the big gainers from relocation, particularly in that global innovations industry segment as companies move out of China. And Vietnam is also the biggest gainer in terms of companies moving out of China to take advantage of labor costs in areas like textiles, garments. Indonesia potentially is a big gainer, but that potential has not been realized. That's also the case with the Philippines. In terms of negatives, and this is where I will end, two big points to make here. I think there's there are big question marks about the medium-term future for both Malaysia and Thailand, because they're very much square in middle-income trap territory. Upper middle-income countries, of course, even more so in Malaysia's case than in the case of Thailand. But squeezed because they don't have the innovation capacity of advanced countries, but they can't compete on labor cost with countries below them on the development ladder. And politics and governance are really dragging their adaptation capacity to graduate from the middle income trap. And perhaps the crisis makes these features even more pronounced than they were before. Secondly, geopolitics. ASEAN very much caught between this competition with increasing tension and potential conflict between the US and China. And of course, it's a source of great division within ASEAN, particularly in terms of how ASEAN countries deal with China. So what I wouldn't expect to come out of this crisis, among other things, is a stronger ASEAN. If anything, an even weaker ASEAN than it was before. I'll leave my comments there. That's the end of my presentation. Apologies for running a little bit over time, and hand back to you, Laurence.
Thank you so much, Professor. Some extremely interesting insights and gives us the sort of the broad perspective in the terms of the global outlook. And I think many sort of issues and trends to unpack, in particular what they mean for the Malaysian context. So I've got some questions to put to you, but I'll move straight on to Datin Ami, because I think in particular she's going to pick up on some aspects that you did touch on, including the energy transition and so on, with the focus on what is the ESG outlook for Malaysia, which is something that's been, I think, a focus that's been intensified in the light of the COVID crisis. So over to you, Datin Ami.
Oh, thank you, Professor Razeen. I actually thoroughly enjoyed it. I found the pace and the content very useful, very insightful. So first and foremost, good morning, everyone. What a time to be at Ideas, for sure. Let me just get my slides. Okay. So Malaysia is leading the region in confirmed COVID cases per million, but fortunately, vaccines are on the near horizon. The US, as Laurence also introduced at the beginning, has a new president, but specifically our interest is that he's focused on re-embracing the world and rejoining the Paris Agreement. Xi Jinping is bolstered by his 14th five-year plan that kicks off this year, and Merkel is stepping down. COP26, to be held in November in Glasgow, is set to be a destination of action. So I would say our session this morning is very apt, is very poignant, and should be filled with great conversations. The one thing that I would perhaps like to make from the outset is one certainty, which is that 2021 will be a year of assessing risks and defining transitions. So let's get started with the basics and see where the macro benchmarks for Malaysia are currently and where we are projecting them to head in 2021. Just a disclaimer, my presentation today is not meant to be a thesis, but rather a collection of observations to promote action. Okay, so in terms of our Maybank House view, we expect Malaysia's GDP to expand 5.1% in 2021. This is versus the recession we had last year of 5.4%. Global GDP growth forecast is at 5.1% for this year versus the recession of 4% last year. So there are really three very strong supportive factors to support this view. Firstly, the shallowing recession in the second half that we saw in 2020 after the dramatic slump in the second quarter signals that the economy is on the mend. This is vis-a-vis the Malaysian economy. Secondly, the continued monetary and fiscal policy stimulus, whether low or zero interest rates, large government deficit spending, and certainly the rollover of many 2020 economic stimulus packages and measures into 2021. The third factor to support a fairly strong recovery, albeit not V-shaped, but U-shaped, is the availability of COVID-19 vaccines globally and domestically. So now with the core forecast numbers defined, let's talk about some observations that will be part of Malaysia's journey to build back better. I always find these types of images, satellite images of Malaysia, put into perspective the important role that Malaysia does have in the South China Sea for the global trade of goods and services. To start off, I would like to perhaps share 3 search trends according to Google. First, if you see the blue line, is the search interest in the term sustainability over the last 5 years, which has been relatively steady. Now, the red line represents search interest in ESG, which has taken a markedly sharp rise over the past 12 months. And the yellow line, totally dwarfed by the other two, is Google search interest in net zero emissions. But if we were to split out the term net zero emissions, we start to see that the chatter is picking up fast with a few major inflection points. And you can see from the chart, such as the UN Climate Action Summit in 2019, Microsoft's announcement of 2030 carbon negative targets, and the launch of the UN's Race to Zero in June of 2020. I believe really it's no surprise that net zero emissions is trending, perhaps in part attributable to BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager with over $8 trillion in assets under management, where Larry Fink, the CEO, has asked all CEOs of companies that they invest in to have their net zero plans available for public display. And as Larry Fink stated, in March 2020, the conventional wisdom was the crisis would divert attention from climate. But just the opposite took place, and the reallocation of capital accelerated even faster than anticipated. So 2 big alphabet soup you see here is SASB and TCFD. SASB stands for Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and TCFD stands for the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Last year, BlackRock asked companies to report under SASB and TCFD, from which they then saw a 336% increase in the number of companies now reporting under SASB. And as you can see, this is really to drive data and science reporting for companies. Now, for Malaysia, with Chief EPF Officer Ali Zakri stating to invested companies, you better have your ESG on before we come knocking on your door. And just last week, being one of the first, if not the first, Provident Fund in Asia committing to be fully ESG compliant by 2030 and net zero by 2050, searches on Google for ESG compliant and net zero will continue to trend. Adding to that, Janet Yellen is likely on the hunt for an effective carbon pricing mechanism and warning that failing to address risk will be devastating. So 2021 will certainly be an interesting year for defining the materiality of risk to businesses and economies. I believe we can safely assume that ESG considerations, parameters, ratings, and measurements are indeed here to stay and will impact us as economies and as a nation, with greater regulatory requirements and shifting global allocations of conscious capital. So let's take a look at a few manifestations of ESG considerations in the corporate sector. First example is on the 6th of January 2021, where BlackRock used its shareholders' vote to recommend against the re-election of Top Glove's independent directors. Top Gloves is the world's largest glove manufacturer, citing poor working and living conditions, the firing of a whistleblower, and a substantive COVID-19 outbreak in its operations. To top it off, BlackRock said it would vote against the re-election of other directors at future meetings. Now let's shift to our cherished but often embattled palm oil. The world needs edible oil that can be produced efficiently both by hectarage and carbon emissions. That's undeniable, and palm oil is that oil. Of course, there are issues associated with palm oil, but now with a viable genetically modified soybean, which is trans fat free like palm oil, consumption patterns may change. Given that the USA trans fat issue was very responsible in ramping up the global consumption of palm oil over the last 2 decades, there is ground to be made up by the soybean players. So the question is, are the risks for palm oil associated with what is typically called NDPE, i.e. no deforestation, no peat, no exploitation, or is palm oil also at risk because of narratives we cannot easily control? And let's not look past the fact that Malaysia's CO2 emissions have doubled in the past 20 years from 1999 to 2019. This is naturally troubling, but this trend is fairly typical of many countries except Merkel's Germany, for instance. Now, why is this important? COP26 in Glasgow on the 1st to the 12th of November this year will likely include a determination of the financial impact of these sharp rises and therefore the risk to Malaysia's carbon-intensive sectors. We often come across the saying that the Chinese word for crisis is made up of two characters, danger and opportunity. Technically, I am told that the second word actually means impending moment. So for 2021, not only should we consider the financial and COVID-19 herd immunity outlook, in my view, we should also reflect on the impending moment to assess two key things. Firstly, the non-financial risks from an ESG lens that could have material financial impact to our GDP growth forecast, for example. And secondly, we should also have a view of investments needed for transitions for the longer-term future of Malaysia. So let's take a look at our view of risk to Malaysia's macro outlook. We will be taking a look at it from three core factors, namely carbon, labor, and also the impact of evolving social values on valuations. With global funds, regulators, and citizens alike pushing for a net zero emission economy, the impact to carbon-related industries, especially oil and gas and energy, will likely loom large on their shoulders in 2021. The challenge will be every power company and oil and gas entity across the globe will be searching for their transition. So let's look at 4 data sets that should bring to the fore the looming challenges and potential carbon risks. Overall, for Malaysia, we are highly dependent on high carbon industries. 11% of our GDP is dependent on extractive industries, namely oil and gas, metals and mining, and palm oil. Transitioning to net zero carbon from such industries will require significant policy, capital investments, and disruptions to employment. Malaysia's 2P, i.e. the proven and probable oil reserves in 2020 stood at 2 billion barrels of oil equivalents, valued at $100 billion at today's market price, north of $50. This is at risk of significant write-downs as oil use declines. Furthermore, in my view, and with a lot of science-driven data, the risk of stranded assets is real in mining, utility, oil and gas. This risk is likely to accelerate rapidly because the US has rejoined the Paris Agreement and may push hard for carbon taxes in the upcoming COP26 summit. Let's be clear, the world will need oil and gas for the next 50 years. Whether it's for synthetics, plastics, off and demand peak electricity, and of course, transportation. So the question for corporates like Petronas, for instance, would be, and for Petronas, who has committed to be net neutral by 2050, is how will they manage the transition and adjust their CapEx priorities? Of the 9.2 billion proven and probable reserves for Malaysia, 7 billion is gas, commonly known as a transition fuel. That being said, with the decline in demand, and I think Professor Razeen also mentioned that, a decline in demand and ample global supply, combined with the fact that Petronas contributes more than 20% of the Malaysia government fiscal revenue, this is a clear example of the transitioning process that will need to take place. Next, for power sector risk, with 43% of Malaysia's power generation based on coal and only expected to decline below 30% after 2032, Malaysia's power producers will be at risk of international agreement targets, rising insurance premiums, and possibly to be imposed carbon taxes. Tenaga Nasional, with over 60% of their generation mix being coal, has seen foreign investments exit from their stock since 2016, when foreign investors own 29% of the company. Today, it is a record low of 13%, as you see in the bottom chart of the slide. At the recent World Economic Forum in Davos, the session on accelerating clean energy transition included Malaysia's Minister Prof, who said that Malaysia will be targeting 20% renewable energy by 2025, and that a new energy policy with targets up to 2040 would be announced soon. Now, to give some context, what we have done in this slide that you see is we have provided a hypothetical example that shows the opportunity cost of Malaysia's energy CO2 emissions versus Australia. Why Australia? Simply because it's a country similar in population size. Even at current prices, if you see the EU ETS price, dollar per ton, it costs Australia half of what it costs Malaysia to produce its respective GDP output. So ideally, TOPA's new energy policy, which will be announced soon, should reevaluate Malaysia's energy mix towards producing economic output with lower emissions through renewables, more efficient plants, or a change in feedstock. Alternatively, Malaysian economic policy should look towards increasing the value add in its economic output at the same level of emissions. The next risk, or the next category of risk, is labor. So as a country of just over 30 million with ambitions to be a developed nation, Malaysia needs to ensure labor practices are structured and commensurate with the nation's growth. High dependence on foreign and migrant workers rather than optimizing productivity naturally creates significant social and governance risks. The issue is not just the glove sector, which has been under recent scrutiny, but the widespread use of poorly regulated foreign workers across many segments of export-oriented manufacturing and plantations. The more Malaysian companies fall foul of labor treatment issues, the more the entire country is impacted, affecting our competitiveness and attractiveness as an export base. Next, palm oil, which contributes 3% of Malaysia's GDP. Now, palm oil has been under pressure for what seems to be forever. Firstly, for being high in saturated fats, then during the trans fat era, the issue switched to deforestation, and now it appears a focus on labor issues. Therefore, Malaysia's palm oil sector will continue to be under pressure and at risk to evolving regulatory, trade, and labor practices, as well as geopolitical alignments. Adding to the pressure of geopolitical risk, plantation stock prices, which have generally tracked the price of CPO, are lagging after the significant rise in CPO price over the past 5 years, and as you see in the slide. In terms of agroclimatic risk, which contributes to 7% of GDP, rising temperatures may have a longer-term impact on water cycles and other growth factors in palm oil, rubber, and other agri-related industries, not to mention physical threats like floods and droughts. In fact, based on a McKinsey study, Malaysia has substantive material risks in terms of water stress and challenged working hours affected by extreme heat. The third category of risk that I would really like to touch on today is on values and valuation risk. So let's talk about some of the drivers behind this transitionary economy we are heading into. The values that individuals and corporates espouse are really what is driving our economy in new directions with an intent that valuations will follow. Let's be clear, the transitioning we are seeing is a capitalist-led, values-driven agenda. So as much as the Trump and his administration tried to hinder progress towards COP21 goals, many corporates took up the challenge to drive an agenda of sustainability from within. The likes of Apple, Tesla, and BlackRock have taken on the challenge towards net zero. Apple, for instance, already net zero as a corporation, has set a target to ensure their entire supply chain is net zero by 2030, which should naturally include Malaysian suppliers. According to Dr. Mark Carney, the former governor of Bank of England, market economy is giving way to market society. Values are driving value. The perfect example would, of course, be Tesla, which is more valuable than all of its peers. Global oil majors' valuations are at 1/4 their peak. Renewable energy companies are more valuable than fossil fuel-based utilities, and so on. With over 60% of workforce participants making conscious choices on their values, we will see the trend of brighter minds choosing companies with a brighter future. So the risk to our companies is to ensure we are creating companies with sustainable future, as over 60% of millennials do not want to work for a company that does not resonate with their ambitions. So back to Tesla. Tesla's market cap grew 7 times over the last 12 months. It is now worth more than the 6 next biggest automakers combined. The valuation question is then, what is it that people are factoring into the valuation of Tesla that they are not factoring into the other 6 big auto manufacturers? Now, Tesla develops cars as it would a software product. They build cars by developing software on unique hardware, much in the way Apple develops the iPhone or Microsoft leverages Intel chips and Dell PCs. This enables a company to improve its car software functionality every few weeks, in sharp contrast to the traditional auto platform industry. Its mission is to get affordable green cars to as many people as possible, not to make the most profit in the shortest time. In its simplicity, if we are talking about ESG, companies with high ESG scores, on average, experience lower cost of capital compared to companies with poor ESG scores in both developed and emerging markets during a 4-year study by MSCI. The cost of equity and debt followed the same relationship. A corollary would then be that a strong ESG proposition could help companies attract the best talent, tap new markets, and expand into existing ones with a lower cost of capital, which would then give them a more competitive proposition with better valuations. With crisis comes opportunity. So we are now at the impending moment, the inflection point of this journey towards sustainable change. And there are 2 sides to the ESG coin, risks and opportunities. An upside of 18 million jobs, capitalizing on the already invested $60 billion in climate tech and working collectively to stave off a substantive rise in temperatures so outdoor working conditions are bearable and the energy system is clean and sustainable. There are substantive non-financial risks ahead for Malaysia with potentially significant financial impact. But it is with tenacity and thoughtful stewardship that Malaysia and its corporates can mitigate these risks, define new transitions, and build back better definitively over the next decade to ideally align with the achievement of the UN Sustainable Development Goals set for 2030. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you so much, Datin. That was an extremely interesting, insightful presentation. In fact, I just want to thank both yourself and Professor Razeen for taking the time to share with us your insights, which I think give us so much to think about at the start of the year. I mean, I have to say, looking at it from the Malaysia perspective, I think I see quite a lot to be concerned about in the outlook. I think if we see a global economy that is becoming more fractured, potentially more mercantilist, that's something for a small trading, investment-oriented economy like Malaysia to be concerned about. And when we look at the drive towards ESG, I do worry about Malaysia's capacity to manage that transition, both in the sense of its carbon and intensive industries, and to the extent to which Malaysia will be able to capitalize on some of those opportunities. So I hope in the Q&A and the discussion, we can maybe find some points to be more optimistic about from Malaysia's perspective. So I'm going to try and cover, I mean, of course, the breadth of topics that we've talked about so far this morning is very broad. So I'll try and thread these questions together as much as I can, but I also want to try and cover all the things that people have raised in the Q&A. So I want to come first to back to you, Professor Razeen, to ask you about the US election, because it's something you sort of alluded to in your presentation, I think, was that people shouldn't be too optimistic that the election of President Biden will fundamentally change the sort of underlying structural shift that you elaborated towards a more mercantilist. So I'm just going to share the question specifically from our friend and colleague, Dr. Jayant Menon, who has asked, a lot of things is expected of the new Biden administration and the return to a stronger form of multilateralism. But already, as Jayant says, President Biden has talked about his Buy America campaign, So how much can we really expect him to be able to sort of change the direction of travel on the trade front and return sort of to a more multilateral looking trade order? And also this, I'm just going to sort of align this with the question from Liang Wongding, which is that, just the general trend that you were elucidating on, that national unilateralism will increase and a multilateral as a model is in decline. So I just wonder, Professor Razeen, if you can just elaborate a little bit more on that, why you see it as a structural shift that the election of the US President Biden won't be able to address.
Okay, well, let me start with those aspects of structural shift, which I think would be difficult for any US administration to reverse, whatever its will, its intent. I think one is it's the fallout from the global financial crisis in terms of depressed growth around the world, particularly in the advanced countries. That has created new stresses and strains within countries, within societies. It's led to an anti-globalization backlash in Europe and in the United States. And of course, that continues to play itself out. If anything, it's widened the cracks, it's deepened the rifts as a result of this crisis. The second, I think, is geopolitics. The US-China rivalry has become a source of bipartisan agreement in the United States. I mean, rare to talk about that in the US context, but we see a broad agreement across the Republican-Democrat divide, cemented in Congress, cemented between national security and economic elites in the United States to take a tougher line on China, not just on trade in terms of classic tariffs, but also extending to the technology threat from China, which of course means more non-tariff instruments by way of retaliation, to, if you like, a more direct clash of industrial policy, of economic models and economic systems. So I think those things we can program into the future. That's essentially what I mean by structural shifts. And it makes it very difficult to contain, to manage in terms of multilateral cooperation. Where I would hope the Biden administration would make a positive difference compared with the Trump administration is on the following lines. I mean, firstly, a significant increase in policy common sense, competence, and indeed the basic common denominator of civility in international affairs. I mean, President Biden has sent exactly the right signals on these fronts, as have his senior appointees. So I hope that will translate on many policy areas, including trade, into more competence and predictability. Because that's something we all need. The last thing we need is what we had with the previous administration, which was incompetence, rampant ad hocery, and wild gyrations from one moment to the next. So those kinds of signals for greater stability in an unstable world would, I think, be very, very welcome. Symbolic measures, I think, are also important, and I would hope for some symbolic measures in the next few months once this administration has bedded itself down. For example, removing the block on the appointment of a new WTO Director General, doing a deal on WTO dispute settlement involving compromises with the Europeans, with the Chinese and others, so that the appellate body can be restored to normal functioning and the WTO can get back to having a proper dispute settlement mechanism. So those symbolic measures. But beyond that, in terms of the really big things that one would perhaps hope for from a Biden administration in terms of active multilateral cooperation in international trade, I'm less optimistic. And I think the early signs bear my greater pessimism out. The early signs of trade policy in this administration is that it's inward-looking and fits in with a more interventionist domestic economic policy agenda, as well as a climate change agenda. So the talk is very much of prioritizing manufacturing, of a new industrial policy, including discriminatory public procurement and greater subsidies. More discrimination on the environmental front, which we will probably spill over into international trade protection. All of that, in the context of new fiscal policy measures, new climate change measures, prioritized at the expense of a liberalization agenda on trade and investment in manufacturing and services, of doing new trade deals, of re-entering the TPP, now the CPTPP, and of rejuvenating the WTO. So that's what I mean by the Biden administration probably making less difference on trade and also representing some continuity with the protectionist instincts and actions of the Trump administration than perhaps some would expect.
Thank you so much, Razeen. Yeah, I think that you've expanded well on why, as you say, there are opportunities for President Biden to make some not corrections, I suppose, but some adjustments to the course of things to build back some trust in the global institutional order, but that there are some structural factors that are bigger than him and won't change in the short term. It's not a question in the Q&A, but I just want to ask quickly to Datin Ami if, I think that, Razeen explained just then in his presentation why his assessment of the global economic outlook is towards a more fractured space that's quite challenging for, in terms of global regulations and so on. But I think it was interesting in your presentation, you highlighted that, private capital is actually responding to some of the urgent global crises, right? That it is actually, global capital is playing that role. And just from your perspective as an investment in an investment bank, seeing the movement of capital, do you feel concerned about the sort of outlook that Razeen paints in terms of a fractured geopolitical, geoeconomic space? Do you see that as a risk when it comes to you being able to operate effectively as an investment bank that operates across borders and make investments? Or do you see that as something that global capital flows and investment banks are able to sort of circumvent effectively? Yeah, I don't know if that's something that you can comment on, but I'll just be very interested to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, there's a lot of layers to that question. So firstly, what I want to be able to say is that, as Professor Razeen himself has clearly stated, living post this pandemic has a lot of, all economies and all leadership will have to deal with what we call the scarring effects, right? So, the loss of job, especially in the lower economic segments, the famous saying is, we are all in the same storm, but in different boats, very different boats. So for almost all countries, the imperative is to focus on jobs and to really, do whatever is necessary to pump prime for growth. So whether it is the US or Malaysia, I think the focus for all country governments and leaderships is that to really ensure that, the people who have been hard hit the most in Malaysia, the B40, are able to actually move back up to an economic viable platform. So in terms of the fragmentation, again, very natural. There was also a question on, isn't the Buy America another reflection of further protectionism for the US? I'm very realistic. Buy homemade goods is definitely going to be the mantra for all economies. All economies are dealing with scarring effects of massive unemployment, especially in the lower groups. And I guess it would be not only social responsibility, but moral responsibility is to make sure that people are able to have jobs and maintain human dignity. So I think that's the imperative no matter where, right? And no matter what the conditions.
Thank you very much. There are a lot of questions on the sort of ESG and the Malaysian corporate sector, which I really want to cover. But before that, I just want to ask another, I guess, broader question, which is, I think Professor Razeen, you highlighted in your presentation, the sort of risk for Malaysia of its current position, remaining as a middle income country. And I think actually that there were some echoes in Datin Ami's presentation when we look at the risk from an ESG perspective around labor. I think specifically this challenge of how a country like Malaysia transitions to innovation as the grounds on which it competes rather than low wage costs in particular. So I'm sure we can pick some of this up when we talk about ESG, but Professor Razeen, I just wanted to ask you, from your perspective, looking at a country in Malaysia's type of situation, broadly, what are the actions that Malaysia can take to try to manage that transition away from a kind of cost competitive, export oriented, but competing on cost towards an innovation oriented economy? What's your sort of perspective on how Malaysia can leverage the trends in the global economy that you've highlighted to achieve that transition? Because that feels like the sort of fundamental test of Malaysia's economy over the next 5 years.
It's not just a challenging question, but perhaps one of the biggest policy challenges of all facing Malaysia and countries in a like situation. And I think the bottom line here is not to go with the flow of these trends, because I think that will make things worse for Malaysia. But if anything, to go in the opposite direction. Let me explain. I think the worst scenario for Malaysia would be the following. Much more environmental regulation, in addition to the kind of pressures from international capital markets that Datin Ami pointed out. And I think that's also becoming programmed or pre-programmed. This is something we can just expect. And of course, economic agents are going to have to adapt to it. That plus no market reform, or indeed further illiberal reform in Malaysia, you add those together, and I think you have probably the worst scenario for Malaysia, not just of not graduating from this middle income track, but also drifting and declining with the prospect of further domestic tensions ethnically and politically, given that the growth pie will be perhaps smaller than it has been in the past, and certainly well below the expectations of Malaysia's middle class in particular, Malay and otherwise. So that combination of much more regulation and no structural reform, to put it in economic parlance, is probably the worst scenario. I think the far better scenario is one where all roads lead back to structural reform. The big challenge for Malaysia, as I see it from outside, across the causeway, as it were, and to put it in cliched terms, this is the win-win scenario on the economy and the environment, is to diversify the economy in favor of higher value manufacturing and particularly services, which are either zero carbon emission or low carbon, or have low carbon emissions. So it ticks that environmental box at the same time. So that transition away from the status quo towards greater innovation, greater productivity in those high value brackets with an emphasis on services and with an emphasis on clean energy and clean environment. But of course, that doesn't happen automatically. That requires some pretty tough reforms to Malaysia's factor markets, land, labor, and capital. Which gets us back to, if you like, classic advocacy of how Malaysia is to get out of the middle income trap. I don't think that those recipes have been fundamentally altered as a result of a new emphasis on ESG, for example. The problem there, of course, is firstly having a kind of elite consensus, and secondly, some kind of popular legitimacy for it. And the context of Malaysia's politics, of course, is not commensurate with those challenges. So I think that's the big conundrum for Malaysia. It needs those structural reforms more than ever. Otherwise, it's not going to get to where it wants to go, and indeed might slip back. But that requires a kind of politics and a kind of governance which seems to elude Malaysia, even after the regime change of a few years ago. And as we saw, regime change didn't really mean system change. That's, I think, the dilemma. But as it is for other countries, Malaysia is by no means unique in this respect.
Thank you so much, Razeen. I mean, yeah, I think you're completely right to say that I think Malaysia, as you can see from both your presentation and Datin Ami's, Malaysia faces, I think, a really difficult economic gauntlet ahead, actually, and needs to address the structural weaknesses in its economy in order to navigate those. And that itself requires some the political tools in order to implement those kind of policies. So, and that's something that is a challenge, I think, for Malaysia. And in tomorrow's session, we'll be talking specifically about the political landscape. So anyone who's interested in that side of this coin, please do join us tomorrow. Okay, so I think on that note, with what Razeen was saying, which is that there is a formula for Malaysia's economy to transition into high income and increase prosperity and achieve these ESG goals. So I think on that note, I want to pick up some of these questions about ESG adoption in the Malaysian corporate sector. So address this in particular to Datin Ami. So the question from Andrew Koo is, what percentage of Malaysian businesses are seriously interested in ESG when it will likely lead to an increase in the cost of producing goods and services? What is your assessment of how many businesses are truly committed to these principles? And I think I can also align with that with the question from Ka Kyong Ong, which is at the moment, he's asking whether Malaysian PLCs are really paying heed to these ESG warnings from the fund managers. Are they taking concrete actions fundamentally to change their capital structure, their business models, or is it mainly lip service? So I think the theme across those two questions to you, Datin, is how widespread and how structural do you see the business corporate sector responding to this ESG demand, both from society and from actual international capital markets?
When you start hearing investment bankers talk about the environment, then you really need to be very suspicious of the one key thing, and that there must be regulators behind the scene, making sure that they are whipping capital market participants into shape. So the interesting quote that I shared on what Larry Fink said is his whole consideration for how he is structuring BlackRock to be in the lead of driving the necessary changes, for example, whether to build back better, to be cognizant of the ESG parameters. is that he is speaking as a capitalist rather than an environmentalist. So that to me is very key, because the one key aspect we need to really be cognizant of is that our regulators, whether it's Malaysian regulators or global regulators, are all have greater clarity than, say, perhaps our corporate participants, perhaps, on the financial impact of some of these risks if left unattended and if left unaddressed by very cohesive substantive collaborations between both public sector via policies and corporate sector via action. So that's very clear. So that's why you have the likes of Michael Bloomberg driving, say, SASB, right, to ensure that when we talk about what we want to change, we are able to measure, we are able to have common definitions of what is it that we want to measure for change. How do we report them? How do then companies get rated on all the efforts and investments that they're putting in? And how can then investors appreciate where companies are at? So it's a very methodical, it's very structured in terms of approach, because when we talk about ESG considerations, ESG risks to global outlook, it's all about the longer term future of societies, of economies, and also of natural capital, right? So to that respect, when we say, are people still paying lip service? I really think that most of us have moved on because the impending regulations, say for example, disclosures for that are aligned with the task force for climate-related disclosures. So the Malaysian regulators, i.e. the Securities Commission and Bursa Malaysia, have actually come out very clearly in adopting these disclosures for organizations, albeit they are not making it mandatory for now, but certainly making it voluntary. So organizations like Maybank, for sure, are ensuring that every line of business that we do, we have an understanding of our own impact, and emissions, the impact of the people, for example, we lend to, and their, downline suppliers, etc., etc. So in this regard, no one is saying that all these changes are going to happen overnight, certainly not. And as most advocates, especially the advocates in capital markets, including the likes of Larry Fink and Tengku Ali Zakri, what everyone is saying is this is a journey. This is a journey that's long-term for the longer-term sustainability of economies. So when we say long-term, we are actually not just talking about the next 5 years, the next 10 years. We're talking literally about 20, 30, 40 years. So, but just in terms of a quick landscape of where Malaysian companies are at, I think PwC did a recent survey in terms of how many listed companies actually align their business strategies to the achievements or targets of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Now, aligning to the UN SDGs is not because it makes us, feel good, right? It's because these are the actual high-level targets that if all corporates and organizations are aligned to, will ensure the necessary sustainable path to development for everybody. So in that study, PwC actually mentioned that so far only 20% of Malaysian listed companies have actually articulated SDGs in their published business strategy. It's a start. To me, it's a good start. And it's very likely to be accelerated, and the verb is really accelerated over the next 12, 15, 18 months.
Thank you very much. I think that, I think it's interesting how quickly these new expectations are taking hold. And as you say, driven both from a regulatory perspective, even if it's initially voluntary, but then also driven in terms of pressure from the capital markets. I want to ask a sort of follow-up question on that. So I think, in that first answer, you explained about the sort of the perspective and intention of businesses with respect to ESG. I just want to then ask you about the capacity of the Malaysian economy in practice to manage this transition. So I think you showed in your presentation very starkly, on the one hand, we have these commitments from EPF to move to net zero. And, EPF is a very significant, of course, investor in the Malaysian economy domestically. I think it's like 70% of its portfolio is domestic. And then at the same time, we have 11% of our economy, I think you showed, in fossil fuel, activities. So I just wanted to ask you, how in practice do you see that these structural changes are going to be able to happen? And what do you? And I specifically want to pick up on two questions from I saw it somewhere from, I think Rosman asked. So Rosman Hamza has asked whether we expect to see carbon tax being implemented in Malaysia to further force the ESG transition. And I think the second question from Rosman is also relevant here, where he said 64% of millennials will not work in companies that don't have strong values. Is that trend also applicable in Malaysia? So I guess the question I want to put back to you, Datin Ami, is do you think we'll see further pressure coming from more areas, like a carbon tax from the government, or labor market pressure from millennials, in order to achieve that transition in Malaysia's corporate sector? Because when we look at it now, it feels very geared to a high emission model. So what is the capacity to make that transition, and what might be some additional sources of pressure, including specifically new taxes from the government?
I think with these massive structural changes that's driving the reallocation of capital, ultimately capital itself is becoming very conscious. And why it's becoming conscious, it's not just about the ROI, it is about the risk that comes with it in order to produce the ROI. So, and that, again, I do like and appreciate Larry Fink's position that he speaks as the capitalist, right? So to me, what needs to be really clear is that when we're talking about ESG, it is talking about risk, right? Financial risks that are sitting in the books of banks, financial risks that are sitting in power plants that are coal powered, economic, social risks of urban cities by waterfronts, etc. So naturally, it has to come with the duality of corporate action, also and driven by market forces, but also has to be driven by public policy. I don't think that anyone would ever envisage a situation where it is just the corporate sector kind of driven agenda. So in that regard, Tokpa himself, having said at Davos that he will be announcing the new, I guess, the revised Malaysia's energy sector policy, that is definitely going to be very key, because the target of renewable energies of 20% by 2025 is a significant target, which will require a lot of investments. And you also mentioned about capacity for transition, right? This is a worldwide problem. It's a global problem. But the reality is that at COP26, Malaysia will have to share its report card in terms of its own commitment alongside the 127 other nations that have signed on for the Paris Agreement. For Malaysia, it is to reduce its own emissions by 45% from the base year of 2005, right? So everyone is struggling with the transition process. And as you mentioned as well, that's why it's very interesting to see that private capital, coming out, say, in this region. And I think the figure that is being thrown around is about $60 billion being invested in technology, right? Because technology is really the key catalyst for a lot of these transition processes, right? So whether it is for solar plants, for example, solar plant to me is really all about electronics, right? It is about the chips. It is more aligned to talking about an Intel as opposed to talking about a power producer in that sense. And that it follows the Moore's law of productivity and efficiencies. So in this regard, technology is key, and ensuring that whatever that we look at, whatever that we study, that we look to implement and invest in, it has to be very data driven, and it has to be very science driven. What are the implications on the climate, on weather conditions, heat, and etc., can all be measured, and again by technology, right? So that's one key area when we talk about capacity constraints, for sure. Carbon tax in Malaysia, I think a lot of it will rest on how COP26 in Glasgow pans out. I think there is a lot of expectation given that Janet Yellen is a strong advocate of some form of introduction of carbon tax or the social tax of carbon. And so it really does remain to be seen, but it's not something that's going to be happening overnight. That is in my view, especially in Malaysia.
Thank you very much, Datin. I think your sort of core message that, we need to and we are stop, no longer seeing, ESG concerns as separable from financial risk, and that ultimately that will need to drive a change in the corporate sector. But obviously that will come together with the additional public policy interventions. And I think it's understanding how to structure those public policy interventions effectively that will make the difference in terms of how well Malaysia can achieve that transition. I hope some of the comments you mentioned there also, I think, pick up on the question from Fadzli, who asked about the role of technology in local and global economic growth post-vaccine rollout. So I think your points there about how looking beyond the pandemic and the energy transition, I think for Malaysia, the key point is how to have that innovation-driven economy, and energy provides the perfect microcosm of that in terms of how we can position ourselves in solar panels. I want to just draw back again to one of the other big trends that I think some of the questions relate to. So sort of pausing on the ESG side for a moment, but I think then there is a kind of route back into it. So I want to ask you, Razeen, about some of the public finance trends. So I think, as you mentioned, two things you mentioned in your presentation, of course, are the unprecedented sort of fiscal or government economic stimuluses, some variation of course, dependent on the fiscal capacity of different states. And then also, I think, the sort of divergent impacts within countries of the pandemic. So what I wanted to ask you is, what do you think is the outlook for sort of redistributive fiscal policies, and how does that outlook shift, between Europe and the United States versus developing Asia and somewhere like Malaysia specifically? So I think this picks up on a couple of questions. One that was asked right at the beginning of the session by Zarif, who asked about whether the government should study and eventually implement universal basic income in combating the equality gap, which has worsened during COVID-19. And a similar comment from Liang Wongbing, who asks about the sort of essentially fiscal transfers between the rich and the poor. So I think in the pandemic, we've seen sort of obviously an escalation of those types of policy tools. And what do you think is the sort of long-term trend? Do you think that's something that will endure beyond the immediate scope of the pandemic, and that we'll see continued sort of fiscal transfers within economies?
Yes, I think a lot of this is baked into the medium term, and it's part of that bigger shift I mentioned from the market to the state. So initially, what we've seen are crisis measures of extra spending, and many of them with redistributive intent. There's clearly more public support for redistributive measures in many countries around the world, not just in the West, to address inequality, other things. So I think there's now political ballast heading in that direction. It's going to be very difficult to reverse, even for politicians and policymakers who might be somewhat skeptical of these trends. I think if we're to look at this realistically in terms of real-world politics and policymaking, given the size of the crisis and the size of these spending measures, entitlements have been and are being created. Expectations have increased. That now goes beyond highly targeted measures for those who are the poorest and the most vulnerable. deep into the middle classes around the world. And it's going to be very difficult to take away these entitlements or expectations of these entitlements from those middle classes. So I think that's perhaps the biggest propulsion for greater public spending, not just in the West, but also I think in the more advanced emerging markets as well. And that includes much of East Asia. In the West, that I think has more worrying implications for debt sustainability and taxation, given that their starting point is higher levels of debt. It's probably much more manageable in the East Asian countries, given that they have much lower, healthier, more sustainable levels of debt. There are clearly bigger gaps in social safety nets in the East Asian advanced countries compared with the West. One big problem I have with many of these measures, it's totally unsurprising. In a crisis, a lot of money gets spent. It's difficult to reverse that trend. Most of it is ill-targeted because the political pressure points in that direction. And because it's a crisis, one doesn't really have time to think of and reflect on highly selective targeting. So I think we're seeing a lot of waste of resources in the way these measures have proceeded, not just on the fiscal side, but also on the monetary side, what central banks are doing. And I think these will have long-term consequences in terms of impairing the efficiency, the productivity of the private sector, of markets around the world. So I think the overall trend in my view is not particularly good. That's how I would characterize it in global terms. I think we are going to see a lot of perverse effects. A lot of these measures have been rolled out in the name of protecting the poor and the vulnerable, and of reducing gaps and narrowing inequalities. The results may well be quite the opposite, because a lot of this money, I think, and this is what usually happens with big spending measures, go to entitlements for the middle classes rather than really helping those who really need it. And as we see from what central banks are doing, these measures are highly unequal. They benefit the richest in society, those already with assets, not those without, or indeed small-time savers. So I think we're going to see more of these perverse, unanticipated measures in the months and years to come. And of course, one final point here, all of that perhaps presages things building up that will power the next big crisis. And the next big crisis, I mean, this is of course pure speculation, but I have a feeling that perhaps one of the next big crisis down the line, or maybe the crisis after that, will be the fiscal crisis of the state around the world, starting with the West, given unsustainable taxing and spending measures, particularly in an environment when interest rates begin to turn around and begin to rise. And then we will be back into a 1970s type of situation. And we may see another swing of the political pendulum, but that's looking perhaps too far ahead into the future.
Thanks, Razeen. Yeah, I would be really interested to discuss that more. I think it's a real, maybe not the elephant in the room, because people do talk about it, but the minute that the extremely unconventional path of interest rates and inflation, the minute the sort of gravity reasserts itself, I think is, as you say, one of the big long-term questions or medium-term questions. And the extent to which the sort of understood rules around debts and deficits and inflation and so on are sort of permanently different than we thought, or are just under some acute structural change which will eventually give out and will return to something more that we understand. yes, I think that may well be the next, laying the ground for the next crisis. So we've only got a couple of minutes left. So there's one more question I want to put to Datin Ami from the chat, and then I'll just invite both speakers to just provide some closing remarks. I think in just highlighting, I think the things that they most want the audience to take away about the outlook for the next year, whether global trends or Malaysia specific. But before that, I just want to ask Datin Ami, just because I think I was very interested in your presentation on your comments on the palm oil sector. I think is facing challenges from a lot of different directions. I mean, you, I think, showed very clearly the break between the CPO and stock price for big palm oil players, palm oil coming under pressure in several different fronts in terms of the ESG debate, both in terms of carbon emissions and land use, as well as labor. So the question I want to put to you is from Roshan, which is, given the relatively gloomy outlook for palm oil exports from Malaysia, do you see companies with these large land banks like Sime Darby, IOI, FGV should start diversifying away from monoculture into varied food crops? Is that something that you're seeing and something that investors will be sort of pushing for when it comes to the palm oil sector?
Sorry. Okay, so in response to that question, it's all, risk, rewards, opportunities, challenges. They're always two sides of the same coin. So is palm oil having a hard time? For sure. But does palm oil also have its own intrinsic strengths? Yes. As I've mentioned, right, it is by far the most productive per hectarage, etc. So I wouldn't actually go out to say that it has a gloomy outlook, but certainly what I would say is that we do need to be on top of the narratives around the production of palm oil, and also for Malaysia and all companies that are involved in its production to be very clear in terms of the adherence, the compliance to the international standards that we have agreed to, whether it is the MSPO, the RSPO, the ISPO, all those clear practices for responsible production are clearly already there. And it is really the onus now is on participants and planters to ensure their full compliance. So the outlook may not necessarily be gloomy. It is, as usual, it is in terms of the implementation and execution of international standards. So, that would be my response.
Thank you very much, Datin. Okay, I think we're coming to the end of our session. So I'll just, invite each of our panelists just to give some final concluding remarks, just 30 seconds or a minute, on any sort of key points you want to draw out for our audience, and maybe things to look for in the next year as sort of key kind of indicators, I suppose, in terms of the overall outlook. So start with Professor Razeen and then to Datin Ami. So Professor Razeen, please.
Yes, Laurence, very briefly. I think in the heat of these moments, it's very easy to think that the world has changed completely. The old rules have gone, they no longer apply, and we can only live by completely new rules. I think that's a totally false and misleading way of thinking about things. I think many of the old rules are still relevant. Beyond the immediate crisis, for the medium to long term, we need stable, prudent public finances. And I think we need to get back beyond the short term to monetary policy that is quite different to what it's been since the global financial crisis. We need an agenda of liberalization of markets, not just on products, but also for factors, labor, land, and capital. Not just to improve the efficiency of markets, but I think it's important for individual liberty. What I think we have to pay more attention to in the future than before, in addition to the global environment, is securing popular support and legitimacy, which becomes more complicated as economies become wealthier. And Malaysia is in that very sensitive spot, that middle income trap spot, as it were. And more attentive to questions of governance and state capacity. Because without those elements, the other economic elements are simply not going to fit into place. And then, of course, one has the prospect of something nasty happening instead. So I'll leave my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Razeen. And Datin Ami, your closing remarks, please.
Probably three things that I would really like the audience to take away. Firstly is that 2021, where we said that it will be a year of assessing risks and defining transitions, certainly it will culminate in a year of action, hopefully at COP26 in Glasgow in November. This will be the critical report card, the 5-year report card from COP21. So that's firstly. So if, the more we understand what is to be expected or what to be anticipated, that will be useful. Secondly is that there are inherent risks in our marketplace, in our economy, and we need to be very aware and understand what are the new parameters, the ESG parameters that are being tracked, that are being monitored, that are being upheld as new standards. And thirdly, this is the key message for me, right? As we talk about the shift from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, to me, what it means really is to make sure that we put people at the heart of whatever we do. And that's the biggest lesson for all of us post-pandemic, right? It is what we do to ensure that people live with dignity and to ensure that human capital is the best investment that we all put and focus our attention on. So those would be the three key takeaways from me.
Thank you so much, Datin Ami, and especially for the more hopeful note at the end there, because I think that, reflecting on the discussion, I think we've identified a lot of, different risks that Malaysia has to navigate, both in the global economy and some of the fracturing of the geo-economic landscape and deglobalization, and then also at home with the pressure to transition and to become more sustainable and to do that in a way that delivers growth, out of the middle income trap. I think that's a serious set of challenges. And as you said, Datin Ami, hopefully 2021 will be a year to assess those risks and define those transitions, and a year of action in terms of making concrete efforts to address those challenges. And I think just picking up on what Professor Razeen said, that ultimately we can only navigate those challenges with functioning political institutions. And I think that's a really good note on which to end today's session on the economic outlook and segue into the political discussion, which will be the subject of tomorrow's session. So I would just like to sincerely thank both Datin Ami and Professor Razeen for taking the time to spend with us, for really thoughtful and insightful presentations, and for a really engaging discussion. Really appreciate it, and thank you to everybody who joined the panel session today. I'm sorry if I didn't cover all of the questions, but I tried to pick up on as many as I can.
Thank you. Thank you for ideas.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Professor Razeen. On that note, I'll conclude the panel and hand over back to Iskandar to wrap up today's session. Thank you.